The Wrongful Conviction Files, Episode 6, The Verdict. Welcome to Episode 6 of Locked Up, The Wrongful Conviction Files. I'm your host, Roger Warstone. For the past 5 episodes, we walked a paper trail of lies and half truths. We started with a chaotic crime scene in 2003 on Christmas Eve, and a man I called the client, who was locked up for a crime he says he didn't commit. We've gone from the shaky testimony of a witness who was already in jail to the impossible timeline of the supposed murder weapon. In our last episode, we dove into court transcripts of the prosecution's own experts and watched their case crumble. The medical examiner confirmed a close range contact wound, and the police own firearms expert testified that the recovered gun, the one they claim was the murder weapon, could not have fired that kind of shot. Every piece of physical evidence, every expert opinion, every logical fact screamed one thing: the client was innocent. But in a courtroom, the truth on paper and the verdict of a jury aren't always the same thing. Today, we're going to relive the most crucial moment of this entire case, the day a jury of 12 men and women had to decide on the fate of an innocent man. This is Locked Up. Let's begin. This segment is the closing arguments. The closing arguments are the final act of a trial. It's where both sides make their last plea, their last attempt to sway the jury. After weeks of testimony, inconsistencies, and a mountain of contradictory evidence, the prosecution had to know they were in a bad position. But they went ahead anyway. The prosecutor stood up and started to weave a story, one that had been falling apart for weeks. They ignored their own expert witness. They ignored the autopsy report. They ignored the fact that the alleged murder weapon couldn't have made that shot. Instead, they focused on the most fragile piece of evidence they had: the witness statements. They learned on the testimony of J.W., a man in jail on unrelated charges who conveniently came forward 4 months after the crime. They reminded the jury that the client's so called friend also implicated him. And they went back to the old reliable felony murder rule. They told the jury, even if he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, he was there. He was part of a robbery that led to a death, and that makes him guilty. It was an emotional appeal, a distraction from the facts. They tried to make the case about the dangerous neighborhood, about a bad person, about street justice, but it was all just noise. A smoke and mirrors showed to hide the fact that they had no case. Then the defense attorney got up to speak. This was his chance to lay it all out, to connect the dots that the prosecution has so desperately tried to leave unconnected. He had a strong case. He had the medical examiner's testimony about the contact wound. He had the firearms expert who said the gun couldn't have done it. And he had the timeline on the stolen gun that proved the client could have never had it. He had the truth. He had paper. But what he didn't have was a jury who was listening. This segment is the jury deliberation. The jury left the courtroom and the client's fate was in their hands. As a detective, I've seen juries deliberate for days, for weeks, sometimes for just a few hours. The longer the deliberation, the more you know the jury's hung up on something. They're weighing the facts, arguing about the evidence, and struggling to reach a consensus. In this case, the deliberation was short, shockingly short. You would think that with so many inconsistencies, so much physical evidence that contradicted the prosecution's story, the jury will take their time, that they will go over every detail of the autopsy, every word of the firearms expert, every contradiction in the witness statement, but they didn't. What I learned later from the transcripts, from the conversations I had with the client, was that the jury had a very different perspective. They weren't focused on the paper, they were focused on the person, the client. A young black man from North Philly was on trial. The witnesses were also from the same world. The jury, many of whom did not look like the client, did not trust them. They did not trust the story of a robbery or the claim of a man in jail. But they also couldn't shake the feeling that the client, by his own admission, was there. He admitted to having a gun, he admitted to a shootout, he admitted to being part of a chaotic scene where a man was killed. They didn't see him as innocent, they saw him as a participant in a crime. And in their minds, that made him guilty enough. This wasn't a trial about forensic evidence, it was a trial about perception. It was a trial about stereotype of a young black man from North Philadelphia and the assumed criminality of his environment. The evidence was there, but it was buried under the weight of assumptions. And that's the scariest part. When you have the truth, when you have the paper, when you have the facts, and they still don't matter. What happened next proves just how broken the system really is. This segment is the shocking verdict. After just a few hours, the jury returned with a verdict. I can only imagine the silence in the courtroom, the pounding of the client's heart, the cold fear that washes over you when you realize your life is about to be decided by a group of strangers. The verdict was read. The client was found guilty of first degree murder. Guilty. Even after the prosecution's own witness contradicted the case, even after the physical evidence was proven to be wrong gun, even after the autopsy report showed a contact wound that was physically impossible for the client to have made, he was found guilty. I've been a detective for a long time. I've seen bad convictions. I've seen cases with weak evidence, but I have never seen a case with this much exculpatory evidence, with so many questions where the verdict was still a conviction. This wasn't a mistake. This was a willful ignorance of the facts. This wasn't justice. It was a convenience. It was a conviction they needed. The paper says one thing, but the system, the unspoken biases, the assumptions about who is guilty and who is not, they often say another. The verdict was a lie. The conviction was a lie. But the client's imprisonment was real. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His life was over. His fight for justice, it seemed, was over before it even began. This segment is the final piece of evidence. But I'm not done, and neither is he. The story doesn't end here, because even with a verdict, even with a life sentence, the truth doesn't just go away. It lingers in the file, waiting for someone to find it. And I found it. After reading through the transcripts, I started digging into the appeals. To file an appeal, you need to find some type of newly discovered evidence. And in one of his appeals, I found a major turn of events. It was a letter from JW. He had sent a statement from jail telling the client that everything he said in his testimony against him was a lie. He wanted to make sure the client knew he lied. JW has stated that he was forced to write a statement in a certain way to make the case stronger against the client, but he gave no further details in the statement he sent. After running a background check on JW, I found he was out of jail and still getting in trouble with the law. Even though this letter was used in one of his appeals, it didn't work. The case was still left up in the air, and the client and his family were still looking for lawyers to help them finally bring him to justice. But there was one more file. While going back through the evidence, I found the weight of the grain of the bullet fragment that was found in the lung of the deceased victim. The amount was too low to be from a 40 caliber weapon. It appeared to be more consistent with a 9mm bullet. And this is the part that boggles me when the firearm expert stated that the bullet was from a 40 caliber weapon when the grain was just too small to be a 40 caliber weapon. Then I went back to the autopsy report to look at the wound circumference and compare it to a 40 caliber bullet. The measurements were off. The physical evidence, the bullet fragment, and the wound itself didn't match the gun the police claimed was used. This detail was a physical, undeniable fact that should have dismantled the entire case. This was definitely something I needed to add to my notes to discuss with the lawyer. Okay, this is the closing. So, where does that leave us? The system failed. The evidence was ignored. The truth was buried. The client is in prison, a victim of a conviction built on a house of cards. But a single letter, a desperate confession from a man who lied, combined with the forensic fact that the bullet didn't match the gun, gives us a new direction. It gives us hope. Now my work begins. I've taken everything I've learned, all new evidence, and put it together into a presentation. I also have what I like to call ideas on what we need to do next in order to get to the next path to help our client get on this court procedure, to get him a new case, or to get him out of jail as soon as possible. Next, I'm bringing it to the pastor and to the new lawyer. You'll get to meet them both. The pastor has shown incredible faith in me, and he trusts my findings completely. The lawyer, on the other hand, is a different story. He's hesitant, and he's not sure he wants a private investigator in the picture. I don't fault him for it. He's a brilliant attorney, and is one of those reasons the client is going to get out. But this is all a sign of a higher power bringing different groups of people together to build a perfect case to get the client out of jail. As we draw nearer to the closing pages of this chapter, I feel it's not only important but necessary to pause and emphasize something profound. This case is not a work of fiction. It's not a dramatized retelling spun for imagination or Hollywood embellishment. No, this story is rooted firmly in reality. Every chilling revelation you've encountered thus far is drawn from documents, facts, official records, witness testimonies, investigative reports, and in some instances, long buried evidence that only recently resurfaced after decades of silence. Everything I have presented to you as truth, every assertion, every timeline, every psychological profile, every motive I dissected have been meticulous pieced together from countless hours of research, cross reference sources, and deep analytical reflection. I have sifted through court transcripts, police archives, newspaper clippings from the era interviews with surviving family members, and even I have obscure academic papers that dare to question the official narrative. My goal has never been sensationalized, but to illuminate, to peel back the layers of bureaucracy and public misconception that have shrouded this case for far too long. What you're reading, it is the product of a mind determined to reconstruct not just what happened, but why it happened, and perhaps more importantly, why it was allowed to happen. I connected dots others overlooked. I questioned inconsistencies that were dismissed as irrelevant. I followed threads that led into dark corners others feared to explore. And in doing so, I believe I've uncovered elements of this case that were deliberately obscure, misunderstood, or simply forgotten by time. If you consider yourself a true crime enthusiast, if you devour documentaries, pore over cold cases files, and lose sleep wondering about the what ifs and whys behind unsolved mysteries, then let me be unequable. You have never encountered a story quite like this one. It defies expectations. It challenges assumptions. It weaves together elements of psychological horror, institutional failure, societal blindness, and human resilience in a way that no screenwriter could convincingly fabricate. This is not just another crime, this is a labyrinth. This traps mirrors and hidden doors, a truth so unsettling, so extraordinary, that even the most seasoned true crime junkie will find themselves stopping, rereading, and whispering, "This can't be real." But it is. And as we turn the final pages of this chapter, I urge you to carry that realization with you. Because what lies ahead isn't just a conclusion, it's a reckoning. Prepare yourself. The truth doesn't just hurt, sometimes it changes you. Next time on episode 7, we'll dive into what I found and what I'll be doing to help the case. We'll meet the team who's fighting for the client and we'll see if the truth is finally enough. That's next time. Subscribe now because justice starts with a question and I'm not done asking.